Hi everyone, thank you for joining us for tonight's event. My name is Rachel and I'm a marketing coordinator here at Powell's Books in Portland, Oregon. Before we begin, I want to encourage you to check out our lineup of upcoming virtual events by visiting our website at powells.com. In the coming weeks, we're looking forward to welcoming Corbin Rife, Jim Tinkersley, and Megan Margulies. Please remember to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and if you haven't already done so, you can sign up for our weekly events email at powells.com. Tonight, we're honored to welcome Daniel Kraus and Mary Roach. Daniel Kraus is a New York Times bestselling author. With Guillermo del Toro, he co-authored The Shape of Water based on the same idea the two created for the Oscar-winning film. Also with del Toro, Krauss co-authored Troll Hunters, which was adapted into the Emmy-winning Netflix series. Krauss's work has been translated into over 25 languages. He lives with his wife and 2 dogs in Chicago. Krauss's book, The Living Dead, is a posthumous collaboration with legendary filmmaker George A. Romero. Not a novelization of any of the films, it is the story of the zombie plague from the first rising to the first fall of humankind and beyond. Daniel Kraus is joined in conversation by Mary Roach, the author of Grunt, The Curious Science of Humans at War, Packing for Mars, The Curious Science of Life in the Void, Bonk, The Curious Coupling of Science and Sex, Spook, Science Tackles the Afterlife, and Stiff, The Curious Lives of Human Cadavers. Her writing has appeared in Outside, Wired, National Geographic, and the New York Times Magazine, among others. She lives in Oakland, California. This evening's event will also include a Q&A. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to ask a question. If someone has typed a question that you'd also like to know the answer to, please consider upvoting that particular question. Most importantly, please consider supporting Daniel Kraus and Powell's by purchasing a copy of his book. A link to buy The Living Dead will be shared in the chat a few times this evening. And without any further ado, please welcome Daniel and Mary.
Hi.
Hey,
everybody.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction.
I don't know how many people are out there, but thanks for coming. I'm pretty jazzed about this.
Yeah, thanks for joining me, Mary.
Just finished it, all 654 pages. It's so freaking good. I barely put it down to take a crap. Really, it's so good. So I thought we'd start just with the kind of for me obvious question, and something as someone who's never collaborated on anything with anybody. Yeah. I don't know what that says about me, but you collaborated with a dead man, which is the tricky collaboration. I mean, you're essentially with his estate and with him in your head present. So I'm curious, first of all, like how it came about, and then we'll move to like collaboration. How the hell did that work?
Yeah. I mean, both great questions. And I want to start by saying I kind of feel the same as you. I never intended to collaborate on anything ever. You know, one of the reasons that I'm a writer is that I prefer not to interact with people all that much. I love to just sort of sit around here in the office. So the idea of collaborating on a book, I would have scoffed at that a number of years ago. But okay, we'll get to collaboration in a minute. So how did this come about? Well, there's a really long version and that would take an hour. So we will do the shorter version, which is, so George Romero dies in 2017. And about a month later, I get a call from his estate. So essentially that's his wife, Suzanne, Suze, as we call her, and his manager. And they say, look, George was working on this epic zombie novel. It was important to him. He was working on it for about 10 years on and off. And what I kind of found out later is that it was a place of solace for him, right? So he famously had lots of trouble getting films made through his career and would always return to this novel. It was a place where there were no producers and no budgets to be slashed, and he could kind of do whatever he wanted for once after 50 years of compromising at every turn, or at least that's how he felt. So they said, would you like to take a crack at finishing it? So that's the super short version. The obvious question is, why did they call me? There were a lot of people who probably would have jumped at the opportunity, and a lot of people I'm sure would have done a good job. So I can't say that I don't know if I was the right choice or not, but as you said, I'd done a couple of collaborations relatively recently that were fairly successful. And although I didn't know George, I met him only once socially. I knew his manager a little bit. And his manager knew that I was a huge fan, like beyond a fan, almost like a scholar of Romero, and not just his zombie films. And that ended up being kind of important. They didn't want to just go to somebody who had written a bunch of zombie books. I had never written a zombie book, nor had I ever intended to write a zombie book. That just wasn't something that was of interest to me. My interest was always specifically George Romero, whether he was doing zombies or whatever. So I had this knowledge of Romero and this deep love that began when I was a really little kid, like 5 or 6 years old, and this track record of collaborating. So that's kind of the short version. And that doesn't include all the emotions that I felt for having been asked to do this, since I'd grown up with Romero basically being my Star Wars, you know.
You and your mom used to watch Night of the Living Dead together, which I think is, I don't know, sweet and telling.
Yeah, it was Night of the Living Dead because it was always on, because the movie was never copywritten correctly.
Right.
So it's on constantly. And Twilight Zone. Twilight Zone was on, I don't remember what night. Let's say Friday nights at, let's say 9 p.m. And she would just have me, compel me to stay up with her and watch. So I grew up, in the 80s, but with this weird media diet of black and white horror. So it was sort of an odd thing, but because she loved it so much and she wasn't hiding behind the sofa screaming, she was like laughing and having a good time. So I think it was a safe space for me to enter into the horror world,
Is your mom still alive?
No. She actually passed away before I published any books. She would have been tickled to. I didn't shift into writing books until I was in my 30s. So she missed that phase of my so-called career.
She would have loved this book.
Oh yeah, I mean, she would have
God.
been as perplexed by the circumstances that led to it as I was. I'm curious, what did you have any formative Romero experiences, or is it someone you just came to as an adult?
I thought that I had seen Night of the Living Dead many years ago. I mean, I know I saw Zombie Dawn of the Dead, because I have here the button from the actual, when I went, like in 1980, which is insane. It says Zombie, they were your friends, which I love. But on Saturday, my husband and I watched Night of the Living Dead. I thought I should just, refresh my memory. I had never seen it. It's amazing.
Yeah.
It's I get it now, and it's a very different feel than this one. And those are the only two I've seen. So no, I used to. There was a really shitty drive-in theater near where I lived in New Hampshire, and sometimes there'd be horror films, and we'd go and sit on the hood of the car, and I saw things like the Incredible Two-Headed Monster. So I had some exposure, but it wasn't a formative thing for me at all.
Were you a horror fan? Are you a horror fan in general?
No, I don't know that I've like I said to you, I feel like this is the first horror novel I've read, and I don't feel like I've read a horror novel.
Yeah, right.
I mean, this is so much bigger and broader and deeper than my concept of what a horror novel is, but that says more about my ignorance of horror.
Yeah. Well, no, it's fascinating because of the things that you write. You dig into the grisly and the gross so enthusiastically that one sort of assumes that horror is at least part of your daily diet.
You would think so, right? I know.
Yeah.
My parents were morticians, or I had a formative event in a morgue, or I really didn't. I don't know what's wrong with me.
Or what's right with you, really.
What's right. but no, this is, I really think this is the, probably the first, I think I've read one Stephen King. I don't remember which one. But no, I hadn't really wandered into the genre. And I'm going to hang around because if they're like this, I mean, this is really good. So but it's, I mean, the whole genre idea for me is kind of I don't feel comfortable in any genre.
Yeah.
I don't feel comfortable as a science writer. I don't think I have the kind of background or brain I don't write that deeply enough. I don't cover science. So anyway, I'm not a humor. I don't know. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm not sure what my genre is, and I'm kind of happy about that. How do you feel about the genre being applied to you?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question that I don't get asked a lot. I mean, I love so many different kind of genres, whereas I think it's a slightly different approach to what you just said, where is maybe you don't feel comfortable in these various genres. I sort of feel comfortable in all of them.
Mm-hmm.
And so I always feel much less certain.
This is
Yeah.
this is an amazing romance, I have to
Yeah.
say.
Well, I mean, listen, the weirdest event of my career was when Shape of Water for a while was the #1 romance on Amazon. I mean, I never would have expected writing a romance hit. I mean, it was the last thing I would have thought of.
It is a hell of a romance. It's true.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, I'm interested really in all genres, and with maybe a few exceptions, I certainly don't sit down to think I'm going to write a horror novel. This is one of those exceptions. This is I'm interested, like Romero was, more in less in the horror and the scares and more in other things. His movies, he only made a couple movies that I think that he was really out to scare people with. Night of the Living Dead, maybe The Crazies, Creepshow's arguable. His unreleased film that's been rediscovered called The Amusement Park is definitely a scare movie. But that scaring is not what I set out to do in a book. What I do set out to do and what I am interested in is the grotesque. I love that, but I don't really approach it as something. I'm not trying to scare you with it.
Yeah.
To the contrary, I'm kind of trying to make it pretty. I have this fascination with. I couldn't say where it comes from, of wanting to make the terrible things sort of beautiful to look at. And I think that comes from my other compulsion, which is to create characters who are. I want to see how bad I can make a protagonist and make you still go along with them.
Yeah. That makes me think that this is a good time. There's one paragraph that of yours or George's, I think more you, that I really want, because it seems like what you just said. Do you mind if I read? It's only about 7 lines.
Do it.
Okay. And this will really show people what you're talking about, what you just said. Okay. And you're talking about Louis Acucella, who's a medical examiner who has just recently been in the room with the very first zombie awakening. Okay. Anytime he opened the chest of a corpse, the vivid colors and textures beneath seemed excited to finally show off. The confetti of sinew sprayed by a bone saw, the blinding brightness of blood, the wet wink of the brain, the bloomed chrysanthemums of mammary glands, the balloon animal arteries of the heart, the high fashion leather satchel of the stomach, the golden surprise of the pancreas. I mean, see, that's you. That's so you. I mean, that's more. That's
first of all, my book of poetry is going to be titled "The Golden Surprise of the Pancreas." that is a pretty good title. Yeah, that's. I mean, if you're going to pull out a passage that sort of sums up the kind of stuff that I write, that's it. Like that passage is certainly me. George left a he wrote a whole bunch of this book, and it varied in the state that it was in. Some of it was really well honed and could be plopped into the book with very little alteration at all. And then there are other parts that were much thinner that he clearly had sort of got down with the first draft really quickly and needed beefed up. And so clearly that was a little bit where, he might have said, and then they cut the body open. And I was like, no, let's get into that a little bit.
Yeah. The I'm working right now on it's just kind of a COVID project. I'm doing a middle grade adaptation of Packing for Mars, and I thought that there would be passages that I could just lift and sort of drop in, and they would, not a lot of them, but they'd be fine. But the more I do it, the more I realize there's almost no sentence, because then you have sort of a lurching juxtaposition of voice and sentence structure, and I've basically had to rewrite every word, which is fine. But I wondered if you, like in melding your voice and George, how did you do that?
Yeah, it's very much like that. I mean, what you were probably experiencing is realizing that none of it was going to work because you have to create a whole different voice.
Yeah.
And so with this, to make it feel fluid and like one storyteller, I had to come up with the Romero Krauss voice, whatever that was going to be.
Yeah.
And our voices weren't radically different, but they were certainly different. I think I grew up so enmeshed in his work that just sort of instinctively, I kind of have a little bit of Romero voice in my head anyway. So we were not that far apart.
Yeah.
But so essentially what I did was after I did my months of research and I started on the text, I began with sections that he wrote. And those sections needed editing, as all sections do. Even ones that I wrote would need to be edited. So I went over that and did some editing. And by the time I went through all of his stuff and edited it and shaped it up and took the thin parts and beefed them up so they were the equal to the other parts that he had written, sort of magically, lo and behold, that became the Krauss Romero style. So it was pretty natural then to just keep going in that stuff. It's a great question, but it actually wasn't. This book was filled with difficulty, but the voice wasn't really one of them.
What was?
Well, I mean, the huge difficulty of the book was that once we had all of his material, his original manuscript and other pages of manuscript we found, and then later we found notes, important notes on where some of the things were going, some of the plot threads. I mean, it wasn't all concentrated at the beginning. It wasn't like George wrote half the book and stopped. That would have been its own challenge, but a much more graspable challenge. That's understandable. This was harder to understand because he had stuff that belonged in the front of the book. He had stuff that belonged in the very end of the book, and he had stuff sprinkled throughout. So it was a matter of, I've got point A, point Z, point C, L, Q, and I had to bridge them together. So just coming up with a story that would fluidly connect all these points. And some of the bridges I needed to write were small, and some of them were Golden Gate bridges. Some of them were huge and complicated. So to fill those gaps, that's where the research came in. And this was a really, believe it or not, a really research heavy book. There's technical reasons for that. Like there were just topics I didn't understand. He had a section in aircraft carrier, and I didn't know anything about aircraft carriers, so I had to go visit one and read a million books. And
did he spend time on an aircraft carrier? Because the level of detail in that section is phenomenal. Man, I've spent time on a submarine, and just like the details, like the way the sailors would go downstairs using only the handrails, or that primitive communication system that's on board. That
he did not.
Did he?
No, he did not. But he clearly had done a lot of research.
No.
But he did not leave that research for me. So I had to start at square one, and he by no means wrote the full section. He wrote, a part of the section.
Yeah.
And I was starting at square one because I didn't know anything about the Navy. I didn't know anything about military
unreal.
hierarchy. So I visited the Intrepid, the Intrepid aircraft carrier in New York.
Yeah.
And one of the main publicity guy there, I happened to be a huge George Romero fan.
Yeah.
And he took me on this big tour of it and really got into it, and would say, all right, so here's where a zombie could get chopped up in this thing, or here's where he could get incinerated over here. And then just read tons of, it's not very interesting to talk about, but from a technical standpoint, that was the research. A much more difficult element was trying to figure out how to approximate, how to invent an artificial intelligence George, because I was so consumed with making sure this was a George Romero book through and through as much as I could. I had to do a ton of months of studying his work and his interviews and anything that would give me clues. And I spent a long day with his wife, just asking her about all of his beliefs and theories and philosophies. And I go into all this in much more detail in the author's notes. So if you folks out there get the book, it'll go on and on about this. But essentially, she gave me a list of things that he loved, like the movies he loved. And then I would study those things. Yeah. Like if he had movies that he returned to again and again and again, what was inspiring him about those things. So I would study them and then try to get inspired by the things that inspired George, Yeah.
And have you heard from a lot of hardcore Romero fans who've read it? What kind of feedback are you getting from people who are sort of scholars of Romero?
Well, the book just came out today, so there's been been very little of that. There's only been kind of reviewers who have reviewed it. Some of whom seem to be hardcore Romero fans. The general, knock on wood, I guess, but the general response has been very good. And
Suze, his wife, did she read drafts of it as you went along?
She read, what I presented to the Suze, the estate, which is a fancy way of saying Suze, was at the very beginning of the process, I wrote up a big proposal. Here's what the shape of the book is going to be. Here's what it's going to look like. Here's kind of what's going to happen. And then she sort of trusted me to take it from there until there was a first draft. So I wrote, a draft that was far longer than it is now, even another probably couple hundred pages. So it was, topping like almost 900 pages. So then I think that's when she read it. And gave any feedback that she wanted to give. And mostly I was asking her to just, look for things that fell out of step with George's philosophy. Not that this book wasn't going to also have my stuff in it. He didn't write enough for me to just seal some cracks. It was always going to have to be, a George and Daniel book at the end of the day.
Yeah. There's it's just compared to, well, at least to Night of the Living Dead. I'm not a zombie expert by any means, but they're very different in terms of, Night of the Living Dead is all essentially in one play. It's almost like one room in a yard in a field. Whereas this book's, the scope of the locations and the time span. It's just it's really it's epic. It's very different. Is that and I guess that's the luxury of writing a novel and of spending 10 years. And I guess did he feel kind of hemmed in by Night of the Living Dead and that kind of, it's looking at a small group of people?
He didn't feel hemmed in by Night of the Living Dead, but he felt hemmed in by budget restraints. Serious Romero fans, they know that sort of famously in Romero lore is his third zombie film, Day of the Dead, was originally written to be just an enormous, epic zombie film. and sort of last minute budget cuts, he had to cut it down to something that actually kind of resembles Night of the Living Dead. It's bigger budget than that, of course, but it's almost one location, a limited number of characters. I mean, a almost perfect movie, actually, despite all that. But he did have to cut a bunch of stuff, and some of that ended up in the next zombie film, Land of the Dead. But some of it ended up in this book. And more than anything, the spirit of that ended up in this book. He had his epic dreams stolen from him a couple times. And I think he wanted to go big in a way that people holding the money were never going to let him loose with a budget that size. He was too independent minded of a filmmaker. His stuff would not make the kind of money they were looking for.
Have the film rights been negotiated on this?
That's an interesting way of you phrase that in a way that makes it hard for me to dodge. I would just say that I think there's a chance this could be a film or series, but I have nothing official to report at this time.
Yeah. Well, I'm looking forward to it. He didn't write the end, did he? That, or did he?
He did write part of it. Yeah. The final chapter is a lot of it straight from George. He had a very what's that?
Tar pit.
Okay, yeah, we don't want to say any more than that.
No.
But yeah, for some reason, when you get to the end and you know that for some reason that wasn't even entirely clear to me, although I came up with theories, he had a very specific end. He wanted this to end with specific characters in a specific location. Mm-hmm. And it was very evocative for me to think, wow, why does he want these two characters meeting in this particular location? And I came up with some theories, but also it was such a great challenge to be writing this, 650 page book and knowing it had to end in a certain way. Like, how am I going to pull that off? How do I get there to this seemingly random point where he wanted to go to? But that was the thrill of connecting the dots. It was such a cool puzzle to work on. I mean, it was never boring.
Yeah. Were there things that ended up on the? Well, I know you mentioned one thing you had to cut, where hippopotamuses were involved in genital mutilation.
You've got it a little mixed up there, but your version's good too. Oh. I tried to cut out as little George as I could. His work was finite and extremely valuable to me. So even if I couldn't get something to work where he had put it, I would try to rework it in a way that I could put it in somewhere later. So I treated his stuff like gold. That said, you write what was originally a 900-page book, there are going to be things that aren't going to fit. Most of that stuff was mine. So most of the stuff cut out my stuff. But inevitably, there was going to be some little bits of his that were cut out, including the infamous scene that you mentioned. That was, it involved someone who was about to be ritually genital mutilated. I'm turning that into a verb, and is rescued in a Jeep, and the Jeep drives off. So it's already a wild scene. And the Jeep turns over, and the rescuer is thrown into this creek, and the woman is pinned beneath the Jeep, and then the guy rises from the creek. He's now a zombie, and the woman's pinned, so there's no way she can get away from her former rescuer, now zombie. And then all of a sudden, these hippopotamuses come out of the creek, and they attack the zombie. And I just love how bonkers that is.
Yeah.
But good God, I could not work that into the book. I mean, I worked in a lot of stuff that took some gymnastics to make it work.
Yeah, well, the hippos. I mean, you would have had to have a scene in Africa.
That's the thing, is that that scene was in Africa, and the book was otherwise very America-centric. And Romero, I've always thought, was a very American filmmaker who, although he's writing about issues that are global, were issues that were particularly American, you know? So I generally tried to keep the book American until a final act that takes place in Canada for very specific reasons.
Yeah, it is so America 2020. It's unbelievable to me. It's so, I mean, in terms of insane leadership and what's going on with global warming and just religion, and I mean, just it feels so current. It's kind of astounding. Although I suppose maybe it's just this is how history repeats itself.
Well, I mean, you just watched.
It's there, but it feels, in the same way Watchmen does, just incredibly current.
Well, think about how you just saw Night of the Living Dead. I mean, that feels current. Like George had a knack for, I mean, people always phrase it like he was a soothsayer, like he had a knack of seeing what was coming. Yeah. And it would be another decade or two before people said, well, wow, he really saw that coming. But another way to look at it is that he was just really connected with the perennial issues that were always going to be a problem, particularly in this country. Yeah. And generally, that was one of our individualism being our downfall.
Right.
But I mean, that's, if you want to sum up all of his zombie movies in a sentence, that's probably it.
Yeah. I wanted to talk a little bit about zombies and corpses.
Yeah, me too. I have a question for you about this too. Go ahead.
And I don't know if this is just me, because I'm a little possibly not quite in the middle of the spectrum on this, but to me, they're very endearing. They're not at all horrible or evil or frightening. They're and this comes through in your writing and his writing in this book. There's an affection for them, and they're more so as the book goes along. But I just wanted to talk about. I mean, even when I wrote Stiff, just some of the, like UM50 or whatever his name was, the guy in they were doing an automotive crash test where they just were hitting him, on the shoulder, and they had him in a car seat, and it was a very long night, and he kept slumping. And I mean, he was very endearing, and he seemed to even have a sense of humor. And you feel a fondness. I don't know if I'm just strange, but no, I feel very fond of the zombies, particularly as the book goes on. But they're so it's funny to think of them as elements and vehicles of horror and fear. Anyway.
Well, I urge you. I mean, you've seen Night of the Living Dead and Dawn of the Dead. Your next assignment is Day of the Dead, because starting with Dawn of the Dead, you could really start to see Romero feeling increasing sympathy for the zombies. And once Day of the Dead hits, you get this beloved character in his filmography named Bub. And Bub is a zombie who a scientist is sort of trying to domesticate and teach him things. And he's extremely sympathetic. He's arguably the most sympathetic character in the whole movie. And as all of his movies go, his sympathies, I think, grow deeper and deeper. And I think this all makes perfect sense when you step back and realize that Romero saw the zombie epidemic. Those were words put into his mouth. He saw it as a zombie uprising. He saw it as an underclass or beaten down class rising up to displace a ruling class that had gone rotten.
Real rot.
Real rot. Yeah. So when you look at it like that, it puts if you haven't already come up with that yourself out there, a lot of things in his movie start making sense. And that was something that he was very cognizant about in this book manuscript, and something that I took very seriously because I love that idea.
Yeah.
And this book even has a character a little bit akin to Bub in this, but it's in a much grander scope. There's a zombie character who moves throughout this entire book, and the book takes place over 15 years. I don't want to say too much, but the sympathetic part of it was a huge thematic column of this book. It was extremely important. Yeah. And I have a question for you.
Yes.
So in working on I mean, I was thinking Stiff, but really, maybe you encountered it somewhere else. Did you ever, in your research, come up with anything that resembled zombies, like uh,
Mm.
corpses or dead animals or microbes or something that had the effect of actual real life zombies?
Yeah, there's one thing. There's one thing that I came across when I was working on Stiff. I'm pretty sure it was for Stiff. It's called the Lazarus Reflex, and there's some point on the spine. If you hit it, if you accidentally, is the way it's been done. And nobody's done that intentionally that I know of. But if you hit that point, the corpse will sit up and go like that.
No.
Yeah, the Lazarus Response. And when I was writing Stiff, it was like the one thing, I think I said this in the book, the one thing you could not find on YouTube. I mean, this was 2003 or 4. But yeah, the Lazarus Reflex, it's totally zombie. It's just that moment of sitting up. And this part, what the hell? Anyway, that's pretty zombie.
For people out there who might be saying, why are these two people talking to each other? Well, I mean, that's a fair question. But one of the reasons is that when I wrote my second book called Rotters, which in a lot of ways was, in my eyes, kind of my first book. It was the first book that really was kind of in my voice. And I used 2 books were extremely inspiring to me. And one was Stiff, which I have my old copy here. And it's just filled with notes. You can kind of see my scrawled notes.
Oh, I love that.
So this was really important to me. And there's another book that I have that I wonder if you know that I used for Rotters. And I feel like every single book I write, I use this book. It's called Death to Dust.
Oh, yes. Yep. I had that book when I was working on Stiff, for sure. It's great. It's very good.
Yeah. I mean,
it's more technical than Stiff. It's very, but it's the whole timeline of decomposition.
Yeah. So anyway, I'm making a book recommendation here. Kenneth Iverson. This is one of the most important research books that I've ever owned. Yeah. I turn to it again and again.
Yes, it was very helpful to me. It's in the bibliography of Stiff, for sure. Yeah.
Should we turn to some questions?
We probably should. Yeah. What time is it? It's yeah. I don't have my thing up. Do you want to just?
I do. Okay. So I'll do it. Okay. Well, question for us both. What are we reading right now?
Well, I just finished a really good book. It took a while. It's 600 pages, so it took me a while, but that's what I'm reading right now. And then I'm going from this to a book I agreed to blurb, which is by a medical historian named Brandy Schloss. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it right, but she's writing about Dr. Robert White, who did a full body transplant. People call it a head transplant on primates back in 1970. Wow. And that whole story, she got all of his notes and papers from his family. So she's telling the story of the whole body transplant / head transplant. So I'm looking forward to that. Yeah.
I'm reading a trilogy of what are apparently classic sci-fi books. I wasn't aware of them. They're called the Fuzzy Trilogy. It's the Fuzzy. You're hearing me right, Fuzzy. And I ran across it in a bookstore back when we could go to bookstores, and it was in the sci-fi section, and it just was. I saw a book called Little Fuzzy, and I was like, "What the hell is this?" And so I was intrigued by it. And ended up buying a book that collects all 3 Fuzzy books, and they're sort of like little cross between Ewoks and Mogwai that are on this planet, and it looks like they're being set up to be used as kind of a pawn in this environmental struggle on this planet. But anyway, that's an odd thing that I'm reading. All right, next question. What were some of the movies that inspired him? That would, I'm sure, be George. I'm a lot. I think in his early career, he was inspired by, when he's making Night of the Living Dead, he was certainly inspired by I Am Legend, which was made into various movies, Last Man on Earth with Vincent Price, Howard Hawks' The Thing, a great one called Panic in the Year Zero. Those, if you watch those are all very Romero-esque. As he got older, he pretty much stopped consuming horror. I think for decades before he died, he didn't read horror, didn't watch horror, wasn't really interested in it at all. The two movies that inspired him the most were the Powell Pressburger movie version of the opera The Tales of Hoffmann. He was obsessed with that, and so I studied that movie more than any other and used it. That opera has a certain 3-act structure, and each act has a theme, and I used that. I borrowed that for the book. The book now has, the Living Dead novel has a 3-act structure, and each theme mirrors the theme in Tales of Hoffmann. And another one of his favorite movies was The Quiet Man, which was a real puzzle to me. The John Ford movie starring John Wayne. And I watched that a few times trying to figure it out. Like, what was George seeing in this? And eventually, with the help of someone who knew him, who had discussed the film with him, I figured that one out. And it was huge for the book. It broke open the whole second half of the book for me. But I'm not going to tell you what that secret was. Mary Roach, you had about 20 books with one-word titles, beginning with the letter S, stiff, spook, slime, and it goes on and on. So why, when you wrote a book about space, did you call it Packing for Mars?
Hey, good question. Because we tried really, really hard to come up with a one-word title that would suggest the physical and psychological weirdness of life without gravity, life in space. Somebody suggested void, which has ended up in the subtitle, but orbit, someone suggested, but that's no good. We just couldn't come up with a good one. There wasn't a good one. If you have one, type it in. I'd be curious to hear it. We tried. Oh, we tried. We failed. We just couldn't do it. Couldn't do it.
Probably had a whole publishing team on that task.
Oh, we did. There were the entire staff of W.W. Norton, my agent, everybody I know was trying to come up with something, but we failed.
Miserable failure. I'm going to take one from Brandon. Did you go back and evaluate or review any of the Living Dead films to get a feel for what type of ethos the book should have? Well, certainly, yeah. I mean, I knew all the films really well, but I went back to them, watched them again, and in most cases, then watched them yet again with commentary tracks if they had George on them. But did I reevaluate any of them? I mean, I was looking at them with a different eye. I mean, I'd seen them all numerous times, but this time I was looking for specific things. I had just a list that I had written out of questions that I wanted answers to. A lot of it had to do with the third act of the book. We were lucky enough that I had 6 George Romero zombie films, and part of my theory was if I could fully understand 1 through 6. Then I could begin to predict 7, 8, 9, and 10. Once it's just kind of like zombie math, I would figure it out. So I was looking for specific answers to specific questions, some of them very specific. And some of them were just logical questions. Like he released 6 zombie films, but they're not chronological. Like they don't take place in the order he released them. And that wasn't really evident until I really started thinking about it. And the order of them is all messed up. It's like Night is first, Diary of the Dead is second, Survival of the Dead is third. It's all over the place. And that was important. If you're going to start to trace what he was doing with the zombie journey and the zombie arc, you first just had to put the movies in order. And to do that, some of the movies told you. Sometimes I had to go to the screenplays. Sometimes, at least one of them, I think he said in the commentary track. I think for Dawn of the Dead, I had to go to the novelization that he co-wrote with somebody. So it was all over the place. It was more difficult than I would have guessed. Mary, I have a feeling you're going to dodge this one, but do you have any new books in the works? Are there any topics you would never write about, even though they interest you?
I do have a new book in the works. I'm just doing revisions on it now. I'm going to say that it's 3 words and 9 syllables. So take that. But yeah, it won't be out till September 2021. We've pushed it back in the hope that by fall of 2021, things will be sort of normal, and people will be able to go and sit in bookstores at events like this.
So now you're sticking with the 3-word titles. You've been Packing for Mars and something.
Something. Yep. Something.
Interesting.
Da-na-na-na-na-na-na-na.
All right.
So what was the other part of the question?
No, the other part was good. Are there any topics you would never write about, even though they interest you?
Yeah. There's a lot. Most things in the world. There are so many things that are purely historical that I'm not patient enough to do a purely historical book. I like to have a couple chapters where I dive into a very, very specific and finite slice of history, where there's some archive that has a delicious collection that enables me to do just what I want to do and plow into these folders. But in terms of a whole book, I mean, I love to read. I love to read certain history books, and but I never would do that. And I'm also I'm not going to do. I'm interested in a lot of areas of science that I'd never write about, because they're either abstract, or they're like physics, or they're everything's gotten invisible. It's all protein receptors and genes, and I like to have some bodies on the slab. I like to have people doing things and working, and I like to go and throw myself into different worlds. It's how I have fun, and hopefully it's how my readers have fun. So many things wouldn't work for me that I would read someone else's book, but I can't be the one.
Good enough for me. Daniel, how much free reign were you given when putting this project together? Did this day have any requests or things they didn't want included in the book? I mean, I covered that a little bit. I was given a lot of free reign after I established parameters. And as far as the estate having requests for things they didn't want included in the book, no, they didn't have any requests like that out front. Once, there's a big difference between a 20-page outline and a almost 700-page book. So that draft would have to be judged more carefully than the proposal, for certain. So, but no, there wasn't, even after the book was finished, there was nothing content-wise that they requested to be yanked. And I think, I took care throughout the entire process to do things in a way that I thought George would approve of, but also to take risks. Like he didn't really play it safe. That's why no one ever gave him a lot of money. So it was, the author's note was kind of, in a sense, it was my excuse for doing some of the risky things that I did, so I could show Suze, all right, so I did here in this chapter here, I did something kind of crazy, and over here I took a weird swerve, and here's my rationale for it. Here's how I studied George's work and came to the conclusion that at least one interpretation is that he would have supported this decision. So they were, generally happy with the choices, and there was remarkably little friction. I don't know how this one got to the top, but it's something about, you have to ask if the hippos become zombies. Well, actually, this is a great comment, because a lot of what the book, there's not a lot of zombie animal stuff in the book, but what there is very important. And first of all, for those who haven't read the book, there's zombie animals in it, which is something you did not see in any George Romero movie. And that was one of the swerves that I took. But that one, my rationale for that is pretty rock solid. A lot of the research I did turned up that George, in the last decade of his life, was very interested in the concept of zombie animals. He mentioned it in commentary tracks, several interviews. In some of his tangential work, like he did a comic book series, zombie animals kept popping up, and he would teasingly say, yeah, I'm thinking about that. So I found even more clues towards it, and I included zombie animals. And there's a train passing, you might hear this. One of the most intriguing things for me was right before they started filming on Land of the Dead, there was a zombie rat scene, and he cut it out for budgetary reasons. But I've read this scene, and it was fascinating, particularly for one reason, and that's that the zombie rats weren't attacking living rats. The zombie rats were attacking humans, which led me to realize and answer a long bubbling question in the Romero verse: is this a cannibalistic thing? The answer was no. Zombie rats, if zombie rats were cannibals, they'd eat rats. Everything was anti-human. Whether you were a zombie person or a zombie rat or a zombie dog, you were anti-human. So whatever was happening was specifically to wipe out people. And that led to a major philosophical revelation that guided a lot of the second half of the book. How long did the actual writing of the book take? It's hard because I go back and forth between projects, but 2 years maybe, with editing, probably closer to 3, which is a really long time for me. I'm a fast writer, but it was a complicated book. What would Romero think of zombie Austin, etc.? So Pride and Prejudice and zombies, and etc. I'm sure he didn't read it because he generally just didn't read horror. He would have probably been, I guess, okay with it. The main thing he didn't like was revisionist zombies, in the sense of zombies that ran, zombies that ate brains. This should appeal to you, Mary. Like, he just didn't believe that the zombies would bother trying to crack a skull, when they had all this soft matter to eat. So this whole idea of zombies after brains, which came from Return of the Living Dead, which has nothing to do with George Romero. He didn't like that at all. And he also didn't think zombies would run because their leg ligaments or whatever, they would be rotting. Does that scan science-wise?
Yeah, well, the thing with zombies, they're both really anatomically kind of realistic, but then nothing makes sense. And so I'm always reading and going, could that happen? Wait, what? So it almost kind of throws me a curveball, because I want to think of a way, maybe that could kind of happen. I like that the radiation from Venus or whatever, that's not, like, we don't have a obvious, here's what happened.
Yeah, he always regretted putting the Venus probe into Night of the Living Dead. It wasn't supposed to be.
That's something he was forced to add?
No. I mean, that was an independent movie. He could do whatever he wanted. But originally, supposedly, there had been a few other theories that were in the movie that got cut out. So all that audiences were left with was the Venus probe, intimating that it was something extraterrestrial that was making the zombies come up. He hated that because he thought the whole power of the metaphor was that nothing specific was causing it.
Yeah.
All right. Does this feel like your work, or do you feel like you're, I don't know, intruding? Well, it definitely wasn't intruding since I was invited, but yeah, it does feel like my work. It is at least 50% mine. And I think so much of what I do was so heavily influenced by Romero that all my work kind of feels like Romero had a part in it. So now I'm sort of having my part in Romero's work. So in that sense, it feels pretty natural, and I feel a lot of I do feel a lot of ownership over it, even though that's within the bookends of Romero, who's he was the beginning of this. He created almost all the major characters, most of the major plot threads. He at least was the guiding light. So he's definitely in the driver's seat, but I'm pushing the pedals. I have no idea what I'm doing with this metaphor.
Can I
Yes.
interject right here? I just want to share particularly Daniel Kraus' line, at least what I think is, and this is takes place on the aircraft carrier. There's a character named Father Bill who has just brought a flower vase down on a skull. Okay. The skull caved with unexpected ease, parting like lips to swallow the vase. Father Bill let go and the vase stood upright, ready to accept fresh flowers. Just the detail of ready to accept fresh, this, you know, skull sticking out of a head, but the image of flowers being put, anyway.
Yeah, that little,
totally,
that little, yeah, that was me. That little battle thing was me. Father Bill, though, was a very, very George Romero character.
yeah.
Some of these are just comments. Daniel, do you have any other favorite zombie movies or characters? This will be our last question. I think we'll have to make this our last question. You know, I like zombie movies as much as the next guy, but I'm not like a zombie fanatic. I was a George Romero fanatic. There are very few zombie movies that I know of that rank next to his or even close. There are plenty that I can see and know that they're quality films. 28 Days Later or something like that. Like I recognize them as being good films, but they don't move me in a way that Romero's do. There's just to, you know, end this by saying something obscure. There's a very little known zombie movie called I, Zombie, not letter I, but I, comma, Zombie, from I think the 90s. That I don't know that maybe you can find it on YouTube or something, but it's fairly obscure. That I always, even though it's, you know, really low budget, I've always felt really fond of. It's got something that is particularly sad, and I think generally when I'm looking at zombie stuff that might interest me, if I was scrolling through, you know, some options on a streaming service, it wouldn't be the description that says this has the most badass zombie war you've ever seen. You know, I'd be looking for things that look particularly intellectual or particularly sad, or, you know, we're working in some other kind of emotion. I think that's it. We are at the top of the hour. I think yes, our host is coming in, but before our host takes us away, I do just want to say thanks, Mary. I mean, it's been too long since I've seen you. It's very, very nice to be in a almost room together.
Absolutely, yeah. It's been really fun.
Daniel, congratulations on your book. Thank you all for joining us for tonight's event. It was a pleasure to host Daniel Kraus and Mary Roach, and welcome all of you. Please consider purchasing a copy of The Living Dead by visiting us at powells.com. And while you're there, please be sure to check out our lineup of upcoming virtual events. We look forward to seeing you at another one of our events again soon. Take care until then.
Cool. Bye. Bye, Daniel.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.